Oxford and Cambridge to some extent are training leaders, but leaders who were shaped in order to cope with the mission of UK, of England at that time. So that emphasizes the point that a university in the context of Tanzania, in the context of Africa, that in the context of a former colony, must be able to perform from that standpoint as liberating the economy, liberating African economy, Tanzania economy, from the bondages of economic dependence as such. So the main theme which we'll be running through in my presentation is a university must be able to live in the context in which it finds itself. If you happen to be a university in a colonizer country, you play a different role from a university in an ex-colony, because we are dealing with different societies and different types of problems. So you meet somewhere in global knowledge, but bringing it down to society, you are addressing different societies and different problems in those societies. If you look back at the importance of this relationship, if you look at the relationship, it has to be understood between colony and the colonizer. Because even up to now, that relationship is still strong, and that strength varies from country to country. Who is going to do the thinking to be able to liberate society from that kind of thinking? The university must be playing the cutting edge role in that regard. So to remind yourselves of what you already know from other studies, European colonization, whether it was German or British, has several characteristics, but what is running through is they developed linkages between the colony and the colonizing country's economy. When you see the Lake region growing cotton, this is closely linked to the famous textile mills, textile factories in Manchester at that time. Cotton cannot grow in Britain. So you had an economy which has industrialization through textiles, but has a source of materials from the Lake region in Tanzania. So that becomes the kind of relationship which was set up. And it's a kind of relationship which was characterized by a cash economy, cash crops. You think you are getting cash, but actually are being integrated into the British economy. There was land alienation, because land has to be acquired in order to grow what is required for those economies. You had the forced labor. If labor was not easily available, it had to be forced. And if you go even further back, you go into slavery, where if the U.S. required to run plantations, they had to get slaves from Africa. So their interest is in having labor. So whether you like it or not, labor was forced. Manamba. Remember Manamba. The savings and surpluses were drained to the colonizers' economy. But all this we are saying, the most powerful instrument that was used was colonial education. In this regard, the power of education in the colonial economy has to be underscored. realized that they actually gain strength, not necessarily through physical control, the army, the police. It's mainly through mental control. And mental control comes through education. To cite just one out of the very many sources, Kelly and his colleague argue that colonial schools sought to extend foreign domination and economic exploitation to the colony through education. Colonial education is directed at absorption into the metropole and not separate and independent development of the colony. It's education meant to facilitate this tie and relationship which I'm talking about. Actually, one Thomas Macaulay actually wrote, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and those millions of inhabitants in the colonies. That is, provide education which conveys our culture, our taste, our opinions, our preferences." So education was the most powerful tool used by the colonial government. So my argument all through is the same education must be used now to reverse that relationship, which means it must be a different type of education, different type of thinking to be able to reverse that relationship which was reinforced by colonial type of education. Education was therefore important in that respect, and people who have written, like Ngugi, Odiongo, people like Frantz Fanon have emphasized the damage education caused on the thinking of Africans who were colonized, and of course other colonies. So that's why we zero in education as a key instrument in getting us out of that kind of relationship. So if we start from the initial conditions which we found ourselves in 1961, as we were getting independence, we have just been celebrating 60 years of independence. Many successes have been cited. No doubt, many of them are successes. At the end of this lecture, we'll be able to establish whether we have really made successes in terms of addressing the problems which were of great concern in the period we were just getting independence in 1961. It is put like as follows, as initial conditions which Tanganyika then had to grapple with after independence. First was the challenge of the lopsided structure of the economy, which had been shaped to serve interests of the colonial master in terms of export of raw materials, production of luxury consumer goods for the settlers, that kind of economy shaped to serve the colonial master's economy. That's problem number one. Problem number two, agriculture was mainly a plantation type of system in agriculture. Reserved areas were set aside to supply labor. There was a differentiation in society and regional inequalities. These were left in Tanzania, and the newly independent government had to grapple with those challenges. The third challenge is around social differentiation and compartmentalization, which was largely along social lines, along racial lines. Europeans, Indians, Arabs, and then the majority of us. That challenge was noted at that time as a serious problem. So the question is whether the challenge which we inherited is what Nyerere calls psychological effects, including lack of confidence, motivation, and innovation. As regards the latter, Nyerere says that this was the greatest crime of oppression and foreign domination. Playing with the mind. And who plays with the mind? Education, in particular universities. So the challenge will be whether you can play with the minds to reverse that situation which was a major concern at the time of independence. So in the early period, in the first 5 years or so, we had a three-year development plan running from 1961 to 1963 there. But this plan was largely prepared by the World Bank to retain the same kind of structure of the economy. And the second 5-year plan, which ran from 64, was supposed to run to 69, but was interrupted in 67 in order to try to change the orientation. This first plan did not question the structure of that economy and did not question the structure of those inequalities and social differentiation. If anything, the Africans took the shoes of the colonial master and continued to behave in the same way. So there was no change in terms of social differentiation, no change in terms of structure of the economy. The major change came with the Arusha Declaration. This was a response to the failures of the earlier plans. First, it had been expected that the private sector would actually take over development and be an engine of growth. But it was quickly discovered that the private sector was very narrow in terms of a few Europeans, Indians. The majority of us, the Africans, were out of the game. So what private sector would be an engine of growth? It was known clearly that the majority of Tanzanians were not in the game. But secondly, there were very positive promises about aid. If you listen to speeches of people like presidents like Kennedy, were saying committed to giving aid to the colonies in order to help them develop. So Tanzania had hopes that aid would come in and help implementation of those earlier plans. Aid did not come in. There was further expectation that foreign direct investment would come in. And even the Foreign Direct Investment Act was enacted to attract foreign investment. It didn't come. So there was frustration. So the Arusha Declaration is interpreted in the context of that frustration. So it takes a first step in saying the major means of production are to be taken up by the state, by the government, presumably to be on behalf of the majority of the people. So it is a way of transferring that wealth from a few to the majority. What turned out later was another frustration. But that's not the story we are putting up today. The main story I'm putting up here is there were attempts to change from the past in terms of addressing differentiation in society, addressing control of the economy, and even in terms of the types of industrialization which was to be designed in the 70s. Our strategy designed was called the Basic Industry Strategy, meant to produce basic goods and capital goods to be able to move away from dependence of the earlier times. So the education was supposed to be changed. You must have read about education for self-reliance, emphasizing the point that education must be a major instrument in making us self-reliant, move out from dependence of the past. And this is echoed quite well in terms of when Nyerere was inaugurating the University of Dar es Salaam in 1970, in August 1970. I was there on that day as a second-year student at the university, listening to what were his major concerns and what he saw to be the role of the university in changing this dependency relationship. So Jerry at that time said, the university is expected to give maximum service to the people of Tanzania and the socialist objectives which had been articulated in the Arusha Declaration. So the university is supposed to further what society is wanting to achieve. It is necessary to understand in Africa and Tanzania in particular, a university anywhere in the world is expected to train people and thinking independently to carry out analysis and address problems of that society. So to him, he was very emphatic about the role of the university in thinking critically to solve the problems which had been articulated as problems which are facing a colonial economy. This is a kind of thinking and problem solving which would be very different from what you would find in universities in the West. The top universities, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, those are addressing their problems. Those of us who are economists, and I believe this applies to other fields, the standard type of economic theory which comes from the West claims that it does not involve in politics. But on further understanding of those theories like the neoclassical economic theory, they are all embedded with an ideology which is basically reflecting the interests of the capitalists and their relationship to the colonies. But initially you will be told that this is objective, it does not have politics. There is a lot of politics inside there. So the challenge for a university like this is to be able to understand that we are not addressing an economy which has been a colonizer. We are addressing an economy and a society which has been colonized. And the most difficult challenge is not so much political independence, it's economic independence. How do you stand on your own feet economically? That requires a lot of thinking. We had, in the past, Nyerere was very clear about the importance of economic independence. And he was very clear about understanding that system, partly because he himself was educated in that system in Edinburgh. He understood how that system works, how the world economy works. He had a very good understanding. In phase 5, we had our President Magufuli. He had a clear concern about the importance of cutting off becoming independent. You could hear him saying, how mabeberu, sisi hapa tufanye mambo yetu, tunaweza kujitegemea, tuna resources. So he had that will. But maybe he was not as gifted in terms of understanding the system one is dealing with. And Hatadui, you remember in the army when we were in national service, we were taught that when an army is going to fight, you have somebody whom you put in the observation point. Yana observe enemy anakwendaje, and I understand the situation, then conveys the message to you. Hamwezi kuingia vitani kichwa kichwa. You have to understand the setup on the other side, then you can plan the attack. Now, if we have to understand the setup on that side which is dominating us, the most important instrument to use is the university. Because that's where critical thinking comes from, that's where independent thinking comes from. Whatever kwenye OP, to understand the structure of the global economy, mchezo unachezwaje huko, then we can strategize on how to engage in that struggle. So the main point here is we have been driven from outside. The efforts which were made in 1967 through socialism and self-reliance were trying to break from that past. But in the 80s, early 80s, that model ran out of steam. And I have a long story of what happened, why it ran out of steam, but that's not the subject today. The important point is it was made to run out of steam, and the model which was replaced through structural adjustment programs, which were imposed. Because I was there engaged in the debates. Tanzania was resisting. But international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, most of the donors said we are withholding resources. We are withholding until you adopt the structural adjustment program. There were 3 options there. One is to accept what they're saying. The other is to stick to the route which he had decided to take from 1967. But the middle road was to modify what we had been doing in the 70s and do without aid, tighten our belts, and move on. Some of us tried to push this part of the solution. But the majority believed that bila aid bwana tutaishije. Balance of payments are in deficit, budget is in deficit, the shortage of goods in the economy. Sasa bila aid tutaweza kweli? So Tanzania accepted the package, which is basically a market economy. And some of the consequences of that package was trade liberalization. Viwanda vilivyokuwa vimeanzishwa, industries, were swept by imports which were coming in freely. And other damages of the market economy, privatization, reversing what had been done in 1967, where privatized, but a kind of privatization which continued to leave out those groups which had been marginalized. The indigenous part of the population were not players in the privatization. An instrument was even established to try to help them, something called the Privatization Trust Fund. Kwamba wale Waswahili ambao hawana hela, they can draw from that fund and benefit from these privatizations. That act was passed, but that fund remained empty. Mpaka leo, iko empty. So those who actually bought back the factories and other industries and other things which were being privatized, ni wale. So it was a reversal. Haikuwa progress towards addressing the concerns za wakati ule. That model also eroded education, health, and other social provisions. Arguing kwamba, let us grow first, make the economy grow. Once it has grown, sasa tutarudi kuja kufund properly education and health. But in the meantime, education and health must be contributed to. That is, you must be able to do what was called co-financing of some kind. Contribute, user fees. There's zikaanzishwa. No free education, no free health services and so on. Kwa tukarudi kule. So the damage which was caused, ifika mahali, that model also, the damage was so big that now Tanzania started thinking of, let us address issues in terms of longer-term development. Because the structural adjustment programs were 3-year programs, very short-term programs. 5-year development plans ikawekwa pembeni. So that was the thinking. Now, after frustration again, we said, now let's go back to beginning to think long-term. So in 1996, there was what's called a Sustainable Industrial Development Program of 1996 to 2020, trying to think long-term. Lakini kwenye implementation challenges zilitokea sana. In 1997, the government tried to come up with a program called the Poverty Eradication Strategy, to be able now to address poverty ourselves, not to depend on dictation from elsewhere. Before it was implemented, the World Bank, IMF came with something they called the PRSPs, Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers. It's like saying you have your own strategy for eradicating poverty, but we have a superior one here. And this one, if you follow it, you'll get debt relief. Some of us try to say, ignore debt relief. Stick to this one we have. But the forces saying, bwana, hiyo hela tunaitaka, they prevailed. Kwa hiyo own strategies kawekwa pembeni. In 1999, we had developed a Vision 2025, which is a very good initiative in terms of addressing the importance of transformation of the economy, transformation of agriculture, industrialization, competitiveness, through building a strong economy, all the good things to try to break from the independence of the economy towards economic dependence. So you could see attempts to achieve development and transformation. Before it was implemented, the agreement was, this is a 25-year program, which will be implemented in 5-year development plans. Sasa tukangoja the first 5-year development plan ianze 2001. Instead, PRSP. Kasema PRSP, if you follow this one, it's money, debt relief. So this was adopted. Do you see the thread of dependence on aid following us? Even 20, 30 years after independence. Inatufuatilia tu. Here is the money, follow this program. Here is the money, follow this program. So we followed the PRSPs, Ikaya Mkukuta. Then at last we had the first 5-year development plan in 2011, Lakina Mkukuta huku. So people were asking, why do we have 2 documents, Mkukuta and 5-year development plan? In private, wanasema Mkukuta is for the donors. The 5-year development plan is for us. I can tell you implementation was very complicated. Because the commitment to break away from dependence, ilikuwa bado hilo jini linatufuatilia tu. So that's where we are, still struggling to cut off dependence. Now in Africa-wide, this same struggle is being made. At Africa level, there's an institution called the OAU, Organization for African Unity. It was established in 1963. That's a time when most countries in Africa had been independent, except a few. So it's one of its main missions was to facilitate liberalization. Instead of moving straight to economic independence, after attaining political independence, 50 years were spent on what was called completing liberalization efforts, like apartheid, Zimbabwe, completing those liberalization efforts for 50 years. Sasa wenyewe wamesema in 2013, that is 50 years after 1963, wanasema now we have been dealing with completing political independence, liberalization. Now we start to deal with economic independence. From 2013 to 2063, another 50 years, zitakuwa za kudeal na transformation of the economy, again to value addition, competitiveness, diversification of the economy. Africa here, resolved. So that resolution was made Africa-wide. In SADC, there is also 2050, Vision 2050 is making very similar pronouncements. The EAC, East African Community, has also Vision 2050, is making similar pronouncements. We want now to attain economic independence. In order to address zile challenges tulizoziona 1961, to address them now. Well, maybe better late than never. But the question is whether at the implementation stage, zitakuwa addressed. You can see challenges Africa is facing. DRC, inavamiwa tu, minerals are going. Africa is quiet. Ibano Libya huyu, Gaddafi, tried his best to push for African unity. United States of Africa, akapush. Walipoona inakuwa ni danger, you know what happened to him? And the rest of Africa kept quiet. Kept quiet. Anaonewa hivi, anatolewa hivi, anasema, wakanyamaza kimya. Sasa, tuna ubavu kweli wa kuimplement hiyo effort ya kuwa independent, could transform the economy. But in this whole struggle, where are the universities to champion the thinking? Because these transformations are not made by pronouncements. They are made through thinking at higher level, like universities. That's where I see a major challenge we have. So the major challenge the university is going to address, is grappling with with the challenges of its economic independence. You see the challenges of social and economic differentiation, inequalities, bado ziko na sisi. The challenges which were pointed out about the issues of economic independence, ownership. Do we own the development program? Au ni mwingine anakuja anasema, here is a good program, lakini kuna hela juu yake. Unataka? The temptation is to say yes. You lose ownership. So how can the universities actually address this problem so that we can actually address issues of independence? Hata kama unapata aid. Give me aid if it fits my terms and what I want to do. If aid says I'll do something else, which is deepening dependence on others, well, you can keep that aid. I don't want it. Can we get to that stage? So as universities has a role to change the thinking of people who make decisions. The people you train are the people who go out there to make decisions. They become politicians, they become other senior public servants, they make decisions. They are shaped by the teaching they can obtain from the university. Can we do that through teaching, through research, through consultancies, to change the thinking so that we can think independently in ways in which we can really attain economic independence, do transformation of our economy from dependence on the ex-colonial masters. So the structure of the economy is still very much in terms of, look at agriculture transformation. Agriculture at independence, Mwalimu Nyerere lamented, said 95% of the population is in agriculture. But productivity is very low, so the majority of our people are very poor. We must start with agricultural transformation. Raise productivity. If you raise productivity, you raise incomes. You address poverty of the majority. 60 years down the road, agriculture is still absorbing about 65% of the labor force. And these 65% of the labor force are producing or sharing a small part of the cake, national cake, GDP, 25%. Yani ka 25% haka, wamebanana humo wale 65. Which means poverty bado iko pale. So the agricultural sector is not transformed yet. Swala ambalo Nyerere alilia nalo 1961. 60 years later, agriculture is not transformed. Industrialization. 60 years ago, Mwalimu Nyerere alilia nalo, we must industrialize. What a strategical form. Are we industrialized as yet? Our industry, manufacturing is contributing about 8% to the GDP. Now, visual observation too, you can see a lot of goods being sold are not goods made from Tanzania industries. Tunaona watu wanatembeza vimaduka, wanatembeza vitu ambavyo vimetengenezwa huko Asia huko nje huko. So industrialization bado 60 years down the road. So that's the challenge you have to grapple with. The problem of employment bado iko pale na inazidi kuwa ngumu, because now the educated population is expanding, but formal employment is not expanding. Transformation, what kind of transformation is required to address the expanding labor force, including the educated labor force? Thinking inatakiwa kutoka kwenye vyuo vikuu, from universities. Thinking to be able to address these issues. Those who are coming from agriculture, ambao wamecause decline from 95% or so to 65%, most of them are absorbed not in expanding industry, but in the informal sector. How to informal sector? What strategy do you adopt? Ya kuongeza productivity yao, so that they are not in poverty-stricken areas of activity, but the productivity can rise so they can also be able to address their poverty. Sometimes we are positive, sema bana muache msiwasumbue hawa. Sometimes bana hawa ondoka kwenye mji, enda pembeni kule. But what strategy of transformation? Something is done, how the syllabus is done, to be able to understand these as problems really of transformation. So these are the challenges which I see. Another challenge which is seen is the issue of science, technology, and innovation. At the time of independence, one challenge which was addressed or identified was technological dependence. Kutegemea technology from the colonizer. Kila kitu alikuwa analeta. Now we have diversified a bit. We don't get all the technology from the colonizer, but we are getting a lot of it now from the East. Lakini za hapa je, zilienda wapi? So the question of science, technology, innovation has to play a central role in transformation of the economy and a way of moving away from technological dependence. These are the challenges, but there are opportunities. So we cannot raise our hands and say we are defeated. Opportunities are there which universities can actually take up. The opportunity to enhance the understanding and the problem-solving approach to knowledge. Hii yanze mapema kabisa kwamba we want you to understand your society and to be able to think about how to solve problems. So hii masuala ya cut and paste, plagiarization, they undermine thinking and problem solving. The enhancing of skills for solving development problems, that implementation of policies. Tunasema policies inaandikwa, but implementation inakwama wapi? I think here the importance of problem solving, think in terms of the problem solving approach. Advances in technology have implications on access to information sharing, and the speed of dissemination of research. Fortunately, in Yapo, we have two opportunities. You have a whole school of IT, e-government, mambo haya, technology haya. You have that school addressing that. So it's not going to live in isolation, but what they can explore to spread to other faculties, other schools, is extremely important. Second opportunity is what we have seen in the COVID period, where technology made activities be done without necessarily meeting physically. Kumbi inawezekana. So what was abnormal during the COVID period can be turned now to be normal. Normal way of communicating, normal way of conveying education, normal way of conveying research findings, and in particular, dissemination of research. The knowledge you are generating. Try to go into the internet now on any subjects. You will find very little coming from research in universities in Tanzania and universities in Africa. Hata mambo ya ndani kabisa. Unakuta articles published from America, from UK, from other parts of Europe. Hiyo Afrika tuko wapi? I believe they are on the web for others also to learn from us and our colleagues to learn from ourselves. So we are not good enough at making use of the technology to disseminate what we actually do. But this is an opportunity. Technology now allows this to happen. So the importance of networking nationally, regionally, and globally, in terms of joint research, in terms of strategically linking with our colleagues in other African countries, in other developing countries like Asia, Latin America, but also in the OECD countries, developed countries in America and Europe. Linking with them strategically because they have something to offer, and we have something to offer. What they offer, we develop the capability to interpret it and adapt it to our own conditions to solve our own problems, and not to copy, but to interpret in order to help us solve our own problems. We have a good opportunity to address local problems and generate local knowledge. Mara nyingi tunajidharau, but imagine if a researcher comes from the developed countries, comes and stays in the rural areas or wherever for 1 month and goes back and writes about Tanzania. Sasa sisi je ambao tumezaliwa hapa tunaishi hapa. Tukiamua kugenerate the knowledge we know from here, tutafika umbali kiasi gani? So we have a comparative advantage in understanding our society better than anybody else. We can use some of the tools about tunajifunza from elsewhere, but we have a unique opportunity to generate knowledge from our own local circumstances and even to use it to contribute to global knowledge. That hii kitu imegundulika, practice hii Tanzania imegundulika haiko kwingine. We have discovered it and we are sharing with the rest of the world. So we can contribute to global knowledge by having that unique opportunity of having access to local practices, the local situation. To minimize the opportunities of reinventing the wheel, we must link with others elsewhere. And linking with others elsewhere in a way of learning from them, but using that knowledge to adapt it to our circumstances, not to copy, but also sharing the insights we have from local knowledge. And finally, we have an opportunity of linking, of improving quality of what we actually produce. And here, quality, you can see 3 key players in bringing quality in this university and other universities. The first player are the schools themselves, and the university administration, academic staff, to be able to set up a system whereby they monitor quality over time. But the second group is the students themselves, to organize a way of getting feedback from students. This is a very powerful tool, bring feedback from students themselves to improve education and the quality of education that way. But the third group is the community, either industry, villages, village communities, or other stakeholders who you are interacting with. Those groups in society who you are addressing their problems, whose problems you are addressing. Getting feedback from them is a very important tool of improving quality. So these three play a role in a complementary manner. Now, in conclusion, I'm suggesting that the university must be linked to its own society as well as to other universities in the world. But the grounding is with its own society, but with an eye open on what others are doing in the rest of the world. This will be able to make us understand better the society we are dealing with, but with an open eye in terms of knowing what's going on elsewhere in the world. The second theme which has been running through is the importance of the university being responsible to excel in those three functions: teaching, research, and consultancy or community service. But these must be balanced in order to be able to complement to each other. What to do in research, the findings actually go to strengthen teaching. They go to strengthen what you do in consultancies. What you do in consultancies puts you in touch with industry and other actors, government and others, other components of the community. But if you lean too much on one side, it will undermine the others. There are some universities which have destroyed themselves by leaning too much towards consultancy. Unakuta mwalimu anakimbia darasani kwamba sitakuwepo, unaenda wapi? Kumbe ana consultancy. Consultancy inaandamana hata research. Too much consultancy undermines research, undermines teaching. But if you rely on teaching alone, it will not be fed with new knowledge from research, and it will not be fed from new knowledge from consultancy and the community. And if you just do research without teaching, you will fail to convey that knowledge to others, to build a pool of skills which will serve the community. So the three must be balanced and be complementary to each other. Finally, the main challenges which were identified in the initial period in 1961 at a time of independence. We got political independence. Some argue that actually it is flag independence, not even political. Politically, we are not standing on our own feet yet. But that's a different debate. But the point is, economic independence has not occurred in many respects. Because we have seen that the issue of regional, social and regional differentiation is still with us. Some scholars even suggest that maybe inequalities have increased. Even the inequalities between on racial lines, that one has not disappeared. You remember the time when Idi Simba, the late Idi Simba, was saying, I know, huu uchumi wa Tanzania umeshikwa na Wahindi 6, mimi nawajua. Sasa sijui ukweli wake, but there is a point that we have not, the majority of Tanzanians are not in control of the economy yet. Kwa ile worry ya wakati ule 1961, it has not gone away. Another worry is around the employment challenge. And they have a worry around technological dependence. Now, finally, what is the guiding ideology of all this? In 1967, there was a guiding ideology of socialism and self-reliance. Hii kwenye 1986, ika 2.0